Today we're going to be discussing the ongoing international and national event of the U.S.-China trade war, the tariffs, tensions, and global implications of it, and we'll be analyzing the trade war through liberalism, mercantilism, and international conflict. A little overview. So currently, the Trump administration has threatened an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods, and in retaliation, China has imposed 34% tariffs on top of what they already have on U.S. goods, and both nations are vowing to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it in a fight for being a powerhouse. The U.S. Is pushing a global tariff strategy also of a 10% minimum tariff on other countries, so all countries will have this minimum of 10%. There are concerns of recession because of this, and then the Chinese ministry has answered with China will never accept it. So a little bit of a background, this has started back in March of 2017 and has gone until present day. To the side, I do have a picture that shows the cumulative tariffs between the U.S. and China in 2018 to 2020. Although it did continue while Biden was in office, it was not as prominent of an issue, but now that he is back in office, it is becoming a more increasing issue. So March of 2017, shortly after Trump was elected into his first term, he was determined to reduce the trade deficits with other countries, and he signed an executive order calling for tighter tariff enforcement. And then April of 2017, he visited Beijing and agreed to an 100-day plan for trade talks meant to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China. In July, that would fail. Going down, we had a couple other things happen throughout the years, and then in January of 2018, the U.S. announced 30% tariffs on imported solar panels, which had mostly come from China. So in April of 2018, Beijing hit back with tariffs on the U.S. Imports worth about $3 billion, including 15% duties on products including fruits, nuts, wine, and steel pipes, and a 25% tax on pork, recycled aluminum, and 6 other types of goods. Later that day, the U.S. upped the ante by slapping a 25% tax on Chinese goods from the aerospace, machinery, and medical industries worth about $50 billion, which then China retaliated with a 25% duties on aircraft, automobiles, soybeans, and chemicals, among other imports worth about another $50 billion. June to August of 2018, the two countries imposed at least 3 more rounds of tit-for-tat tariffs, affecting more than $250 billion worth of Chinese goods and $110 billion worth of U.S. imports to China. And then in January of 2020, the U.S. and China signed a Phase 1 trade deal through which China commits to buying an additional $200 billion of U.S. goods and services over the next 2 years. Now, in March of 2025, the additional 10% tariffs on all countries would go into effect, including China. China responded with the additional tariffs of up to 15% on imports from the U.S. farm products. And then in April of 2025, so now, Trump started his Tariff Liberation Day, which he announced an additional 34% duties on all Chinese imports, alongside tariffs on goods from other countries around the world. And that took place on April 9th. China announced another retaliatory move, including more export controls on rare earth minerals, and filed a lawsuit at the World Trade Organization. It also suspended imports of poultry and bone meal from several U.S. companies and added 27 firms to the list of companies facing trade restrictions, and started an anti-monopoly probe into DuPont China Group Co. Looking into liberalism versus mercantilism, U.S. under Trump shows more of a mercantilism approach. China, on the other hand, has a mix of both, more recently going more towards the mercantilism. To the side, I have a chart of some comparisons between the U.S. and China on their trade philosophies, government roles, key economic tools, supply chain strategies, technology and innovation, and the use of their international institutes. So we do know that liberalism is a political and economic doctrine that emphasizes individual autonomy, equality of opportunity, and the protection of individual rights, where mercantilism is an economic practice by which governments use their economies to augment state power at the expense of other countries. With the imposing of high tariffs from Trump, we were set at a mercantilist approach. The claim of this is to protect domestic industries, reduce the trade deficit, and pressure China to change its trade practices. Through the U.S. government and Trump, any U.S. losses were seen as China's gains, which did not make Trump happy. This idea is what started the increase of tariffs on not only China, but all other countries as well. China was just the one that was hit the hardest. Trump wanted to reassert the U.S. as a power country and its economic dominance by using the tariffs as leverage. Not only has he gone as far as to increase these tariffs and potentially lose out on important Chinese goods, he's targeted other Chinese firms. For example, a big one right now is TikTok. He implemented a ban on TikTok in the U.S. unless China agreed to sell the app to them. The whole situation has left the liberal approach that had defined the U.S. for many years in the past and has signaled a shift towards an economic nationalism. On the other hand, with China, they have strategically combined the benefits of open global markets with strong state control over key sectors. In 2001, China had joined the World Trade Organization and since embraced liberal trade practices to increase its economic growth. This liberal orientation has allowed China to become the world's largest exporter and central player in international trade. The Chinese government maintains tight control over strategic industries through subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and industrial policy programs like the Made in China 2025. That aims to dominate advanced sectors such as semiconductors, electrical vehicles, and artificial intelligence. Putting these into context of the U.S.-China trade war, China has deployed distinctly mercantilist tools, imposing the retaliatory tariffs, restricting rare earth exports, and targeting American companies with regulatory measures and trade blacklists. Still, it continues to advocate for multilateralism and open trade, particularly in forums like the World Trade Organization or through regional agreements such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Because of this dual strategy, China can benefit from global liberal trade systems while advancing its national economic interests through mercantilist tactics. This gives it a flexible and powerful position in the international economic order. Looking at warfare, the conflicts of ideas versus the conflict of interest. In conflict of ideas, we have the competing ideologies. For example, democracy versus authoritarianism, and capitalism versus state-led capitalism, and then also ideological mistrust. Through this, so the United States is rooted in a liberal democratic values and market-driven economic system. It views open trade, transparency, and individual enterprise as essential to both economic prosperity and political freedom. China, on the other hand, operates under a one-party authoritarian regime that blends elements of capitalism with strict state control, using state-owned enterprises, industrial policy, and top-down economic planning to drive national development. Because of this ideological divergence, it fuels a deep mistrust between the two. U.S. leaders often see China's economic rise as inseparable from its political model, raising concerns about technology transfer, surveillance, corporate influence, and unfair competition, while China views American efforts to contain its rise through tariffs, sanctions, and export bans as attempts to preserve Western dominance and undermine its sovereignty. The ideological mistrust intensifies trade disputes, turning what could be a negotiation over economic terms into a broader battle over the future global order. It's not just about who trades what, it's about which system defines the rules of international engagement in this century. As far as conflict of interest, we have our trade deficits, which, as speaked about before, we know that have been a big issue as the U.S. has been in a big trade deficit with China for years now, going back to about 1980. And then the U.S. just wants fairness while China wants growth and industrial sovereignty. So at the moment, the U.S. just wants to make the trades fair. They see that China is getting more out of it because we buy so much from them, but they don't buy as much from us, which is what has put us in this trade deficit. China won't give up because they want to keep this higher ranking and power over us. Next, we have our international system and how this is affected. So we have the global institutions and orders. To start, we have the undermining of the World Trade Organization norms. So like I stated earlier, the World Trade Organization had welcomed China, and China signed with them a while back, and they have followed those rules, taking on that liberal approach for a while now, but recently have been kind of putting those values and norms to the side because they've been trying to focus on themselves and what they can do for their own country rather than what they can do to assist the whole world and how this will play out for everyone else. The U.S. still has been mistrusting and stayed away from the World Trade Organization norms because they don't see a benefit to it for them. And then we have increased unilateralism, which is the process or fact of deciding a policy or action without involving another group or country. So same thing, the China and the U.S. are working kind of on their own terms to what will benefit them the best rather than what they can do as a whole for the whole world. All the other surrounding countries, they're kind of focused more on themselves. Global repercussions, we have the European Union, Japan, and a bunch of other countries, almost all other countries, who are caught in the crossfire of this with their tariffs being increased, especially from the U.S. So they hit with that 10% increase or 10% minimum on tariffs because of this, so that China can't sell products to them and then have the U.S. buy from them with no tariff, because then China gets their way and don't have to pay anything. So again, the U.S. is kind of just looking out for itself. And JP Morgan estimates a recession of 40% or more here in the near future. Bruce Kasman, which is the chief global economist at JP Morgan, said, "We now see a material higher risk of global recession. The administration's shift in the application of tariff policy and the potential impact on sentiment have contributed to this risk increase." So what's at stake? What's at stake with this? In the United States, we are looking at an inflation to above 4%, which is the highest it has been in a very long time, and also job loss. Even back in when Trump was first inaugurated, when we had our last recession, the job loss was estimated to be around 200,000, and we're looking at an even bigger increase than that. And then in China, that job loss may become the same, but the biggest thing they're looking at is a lower growth rate percentage, which they are already lower than they have been in years, and it could go down even more. They like to stay at a 5%, and right now they're at a 4.5% and could go even lower. Both of them are looking at future global trade governance and global economic stability going down. So as both nations bypass multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization in favor of direct economic retaliation, the credibility and authority of these global bodies have weakened a lot. The trend toward unilateral tariff policies and economic nationalism could inspire other countries to kind of take on these similar tactics and measures, which undermine the rule-based trading system that was established after World War II. And then with tariffs rising rapidly on both sides, businesses face higher costs, they disrupt supply chains and growing uncertainty, and conditions that can suppress investment and economic growth worldwide. If this is prolonged, the standoff may weaken global demand, inflate prices, and undermine confidence in the predictability of international trade, with ripple effects felt far beyond the U.S. and China and can be all over the world. So, I liked this quote. If tariffs keep going up and up, it becomes a battle of wills and principles rather than economics. This was said by senior economics for China at the Economist Intelligence Unit. So basically, what it's saying is we are eventually going to go into this battle that is more about the countries themselves and holding their ground and like dignity rather than the economics and how it's affecting the world. So it's kind of just like standing up for themselves even if everyone else goes down with them. So questions I'd like you to think on is this conflict more about economics or ideology? So at what point does it go past we're doing what's good for our country and what's going to build up our country, or we're doing this to stand our ground and just show that we're better and we're not going to let down? And then I have my sources.